Amar Ambrose woke up promptly with his alarm, shutting it off quickly as he slid out of bed next to his beautiful wife. Even after being married for 30 years, she was just as lovely to him now, asleep as she was when he saw her walking down the aisle. As Amar quietly got ready for his day, he dressed in a gray suit today, with a bright green tie as he carefully combed his graying hair. His son and daughter, Alexander and Alexis, respectively, often teased him for years about how he would always dress up nice every day, even if he was only going to stay home for the entire day. But he was glad that his final child, Alex, inherited his fashion sensibilities and would dress up every day when they went to work, even for years afterwards. Alex wasn't the name Amar nor his wife Annie chose for them, but it was a great name for them. Amar, now dressed for the day, went downstairs to prepare for the day. He started the coffee brewing, not for himself, but so Annie would have fresh coffee when she did wake up. He grabbed his tablet as he began to read over the local news gazette while he quietly ate his toast. Catfish Creek Church announced it was doing a bake sale this Saturday, he noted, as he scrolled through the article, savoring each word even more than he savored his orange juice and toast. There wasn't a whole lot that happened in Catfish Creek, but the Gazette still worked hard to put articles out every day. Usually the articles were explanations of laws from the imperial government or from the city government, and how they would apply to Catfish Creek. But the Catfish Creek Gazette also reported on local happenings, such as bake sales, visiting carnivals, fishing tournaments, wild animal sightings, countdowns to hunting season, and anything unusual. Finally, at the end of the article, Amar smiled when he saw the name of the person who wrote for the Catfish Creek Gazette, written by Alexis Ambrose. He couldn't help it, but he smiled when he saw his daughter's name on the Gazette. She was Catfish Creek's best and only investigative journalist. Despite the lack of competition, it didn't mean that she wasn't good at her job. She was the one who wrote and verified every article, whether it was a missing child lost in the woods, thought to be living with wolves, a visiting carnival rumored to accept human flesh as fare, a swamp meet that everyone knew was a cover for running guns to Swamp City, or even a perfectly normal bake sale. Alexis Ambrose would dig until she got to the truth. Every time. Amar scrolled to the next article, which drew his eye in, as he had another big smile when he saw his name in the article. It was the announcement of a visiting hunters convention that would be gathering at Amar Ambrose's hotel, the Mudcat Inn. He and Amar Ambrose, who had been a member of the Hunters Guild for 40 years. And while it was a 3-day event, it didn't discuss what was going to happen at the visiting convention. But the article did spend 4 paragraphs explaining what the visiting hunters would do for the local economy. Amar nodded at the reading of it. The key words were all there. Those who knew would know, and those that didn't need to know wouldn't know. Most of the townsfolk would be distracted by the idea of so many people fishing in Catfish Creek, which, as the name suggests, made most of its money off of fishing. Regular visitors already happened, but a huge influx of visitors would help the town thrive. And it would also draw their eyes away from the fact that Amar was a hunter for 40 years, but no one in town had ever seen him hunting in the woods. Amar's breakfast now done, he went to the front desk of the Mudcat Inn, his own personal hotel in the town of Catfish Creek. There he relieved Larry of his duties. Larry was one of Amar's workers, a very pale man with red eyes who was always dressed in black. Amar nodded towards the man, who smiled back, revealing his very sharp eye teeth as he left the hotel, disappearing into the darkness as Amar waited for the sun to rise. Amar had a seat for the front desk while he waited for guests, and he couldn't help but reminisce about his past. Even though now his hair was gray, he was once a young man in Catfish Creek, and he still thought about what it was like back then. Catfish Creek was, and still is, an unincorporated township that was a part of Swamp City, even though Swamp City was over 2 hours away by car. And when Amar was growing up in Catfish Creek, it had a lot more in common with Swamp City than it did now. The town was notoriously unsafe when the sun set. It was expected that anyone who was caught out late at night was fair game. It was well known who was doing the killings. They would often write their names on the streets with the victim's blood, and they would brag about it often. Growing up, Amar knew it was wrong what was happening in Catfish Creek, but his parents and all of the adults refused to do anything about it. They just kept telling Amar to just stay in his room and to ignore the screams. Being a child and then a teenager in Catfish Creek often meant eyeing your teachers and neighbors with suspicion. They were open secrets that lived normal lives during the day, but at night they were monsters. The science teacher that would spend extra time making sure every student understood the scientific method would, that same night, send back the bleached bones of those same students back to their parents for the crime of being rude to him in class. The town doctor, who was the only medical professional around for miles, that had warm smiles for everyone, would leave his initial on every organ of his victims. But he would leave them alive during the process, as a demonstration as his skill as a man of medicine. Or the Flynn family, who were the best fishermen in all of Catfish Creek, but who would only fish at night using human flesh as the bait. Where did they get the bait? From anyone else who dared to fish at night. Again, this was all well known by everyone in town, but every Sunday everyone gathered in the church and everyone pretended it wasn't happening. Even though the priest spent more time reading eulogies than sermons, no one was able to do anything about it. They feared the ones who prowled the streets so much, and even the lone sheriff wouldn't do anything. He was too busy drinking himself to oblivion to do anything but hurt his own family. When Amar took over the Mudcat Inn, when both of his parents simply vanished, no explanation, no investigation, no bodies, and no note, Amar figured they simply left, unable to deal with the dangers of Catfish Creek, and just wanted to leave him behind. But even with his parents seemingly abandoning him, something changed in him that night. He made a promise to himself. He would make things better, by any means necessary. The next day, he went to the small Catfish Creek library to look over all of the newspaper articles they got from Swamp City. But sadly, all the articles were less than encouraging. Piles upon piles of papers, telling Amar about how another killer took another life. The way the articles were written, he never thought about it growing up, but reading one after the other, the pattern was clear. The writers were obsessed over the killers. There were paragraphs describing the bodies and how they were described in the morning. Maybe a paragraph reminding people not to go out at night, like the wolves that were out there were just an inevitable force of nature that the victim simply walked into, like a rainstorm or an earthquake. But Amar knew from the newspaper articles he got from places like River City and Isle City that not everyone treated it the same way. River City tended to focus on the investigation into bringing justice for the departed, and the eulogy spent more time describing what the victims did in life, rather than going on and on describing their death and their killer, completely skipping over who the person was. Isle City focused on the resolution towards the killers and who managed to bring them down. So Amar knew that the way Swamp City treated the victims after their death wasn't the way that everyone treated the dead. After studying for so long, he met Annie, his future wife, who worked at and still worked at the library, and they gradually fell in love. Just like Amar, she was tired of how Catfish Creek was not a place where the night could be safe. So the two of them sought out any kind of answers they could in the archives. A few times Amar brought up trying to fight back or even setting up a trap for the killers, but Annie was quick to point out what could happen. Many people had tried to trap or even fight back against the wolves, and all of them had failed. Even in school and even in the Gazette, it was said that if you found yourself out at night, your only chance was to hide or to run. And while in Swamp City proper, killers and wolves regularly fought or even killed each other, within the town of Catfish Creek, they all avoided each other. Like they agreed that each would get their own part of Catfish Creek to prowl. At least, that was what Amar and Annie thought for a very long time. But then there was news from Swamp City that was front page news. Within the inner city, the infamous Cannibal King, a killer with over 200 confirmed kills and with theorized kills well into the thousands, not only was he just killed, but he was revealed to be the governor of Swamp City. His body was found in his home with an arrow fired through his head, heart, and throat. His killer revealed documents proving his guilt to every newspaper in Swamp City, including the Catfish Creek Gazette. But she also sent a letter to the newspapers. While no newspaper revealed the entire letter, both Amar and Annie were able to piece together what the letter said by examining the excerpts from all of the newspapers. Salutations, splendid citizens of Swamp City. As you know by now, your governor was the cruel Cannibal King, who has been active over the last 10 years. He believed himself untouchable, politically, financially, and physically. But, as I have proven just last night, no monster within Swamp City is untouchable. And there are many monsters within Swamp City. Most of them are human. I know that a lot of the citizens are tired of the wolves constantly at their door, tired of being afraid, tired of being told never to fight back, tired of being told to freeze before an unstoppable force of nature that no one could stop. And yet, here I stand, with proof that not only that the monsters aren't unstoppable, I have proof that fighting back is something that will work. I know you are all told that no one has ever managed to kill the killers, but I am here to promise you, they have been killed before, and they will be killed again. The greatest lie a monster can tell you is that they are invincible and that it is pointless to fight back. What kind of invincible beast would tell you not to fight? Citizens of Swamp City, this is a reminder. If you feel helpless, you can always reach out to the Hunters Guild. We are the ones who bring the monsters down. And to all the monsters who are reading this, you know who you are, and you know we will find you. You may consider yourself a predator living among prey, but you should remember, if even the strongest among you, who has the full protection of the Imperial government, was killed by a single hunter, what can you possibly do against everyone? Artemis, of the Gorgon chapter of the Hunters Guild. The next 2 weeks were some of the quietest weeks that Amar had ever seen. There were no screams at night, no bodies found in the morning, and that Sunday the priest had no names for the eulogy section. So there was only quiet prayer during that last hour of church. The week afterwards was even better. The tension in the town felt like it was starting to leak away. Most of the townsfolk were more relaxed in public. Not like that they were putting up a facade, but like they were actually comfortable in town again. Some for the first time ever. Well, most of the town was like that. There were still some who were jumping at every sound and avoiding every shadow. Amar and Annie figured out that those were all the wolves living among them. What shocked Amar most wasn't how many people among them were actually wolves, but how few of them actually were. When he was a child, what his parents taught him was stranger danger. They taught him about avoiding people, about fearing friends, and even about how the kindest of folks always have the creepiest of secrets. What he learned after that article was released that most of the people around him were just scared too. The wolves weren't secretly circling him his entire life. They were few, and now that he knew what they looked like, he wasn't as scared of them as he was his entire life. That next Sunday, there were also no eulogies, so the priest spent that time talking about the new visitors in town. The priest spoke about how wonderful it was that there were new visitors, such as a woman in a long scarf who was kind enough to help carry bags in for him and his wife while they were grocery shopping. And he spoke about how great it was that the town was enjoying tourism and peace again. And the priest talked about how amazing it was that Catfish Creek was enjoying quiet nights, and he considered it a turning point for everyone in the town. That week, there were a few more deaths. The Sunday after that, the priest had to fight hard to keep the smile off his face as he read those eulogies. The first death was the science teacher that was found in his own tub with only his bones remaining, and all of his victims' pictures gathered in a pile next to his tub. Despite the foul nature of his death, no one wanted a closed casket for him. Everyone wanted to see his bleached skeleton and breathe a sigh of relief that no more children's bones would be found in their parents' homes. The death afterwards was the lone sheriff in town. His hands, tongue, and liver were all removed, and all of the alcohol in his house was found in his stomach. That Sunday was the first time that both Amar and Annie had ever seen the sheriff's wife and children smile, and the first time they were able to see their faces uncovered. The next death was that of Mr. Flynn, who was found by one of the visiting women in the swamp, with catfish still nibbling at his body. He drowned in swamp water that was only 2 feet deep. His death was ultimately ruled an accident, but still none shed any tears for Mr. Flynn the fisherman as he was put in the ground. The final death was the town doctor. His case was the strangest. He was found in his own waiting room with the door locked on the inside. His face was carved like a Samhain pumpkin with his own scalpels. Both of his hands still clutching at the handles, with the blade still embedded in his skin. Due to the circumstances of his death, it was ultimately ruled a suicide by the sheriff's wife. This destroyed waiting room and massive mess simply looked over like so many other messes in Catfish Creek. And as for Amar and Annie's part in it, all they did was their jobs. All they did was find a good phone number to call a professional. They told them about the problems they had in Catfish Creek for their entire lives. And then soon afterwards, Catfish Creek had a few new visitors. And as for the visitors, one was a young woman who spoke quietly and always wore a long pink scarf, even though it was summer outside. And Amar was certain she wasn't cold. Amar told her about a science teacher who was happy to tutor her about chemistry that very night. Another visitor was a tall woman who wore a dress that glittered green and gold, even in low light. She smelled like the ocean, and despite her bright smile, it never reached her eyes, which were like the sea. Cold, cruel and endless. Amar and Annie told her about the best places to find catfish and what spots were claimed by Mr. Flynn. The third visitor was a woman who wore a dark green hijab and wore sunglasses all the time, even indoors. Her long nails were painted a glittering bronze color, and her fingers never stopped moving. She was cold to Amar and preferred speaking to Annie instead. Annie told this visitor how to find the sheriff if she ever needed to see him, for any reason at all. The final one of these unusual women was a woman dressed in a leather coat with spikes, and she wore a blue medical mask at all times, as far as both Amar and Annie saw. She often examined herself in her own mirror, correcting her eye makeup, even when speaking with Amar. He told her about the local doctor, who considered himself one of the best cosmetic surgeons in all of Swamp City. What those visitors did while visiting Catfish Creek was none of Amar's business. He did his job by selling them their rooms in the motel, and his wife did her job by pointing out the things that they both thought would interest the visitors. The visitors stayed for a week before leaving, promised to send friends to the magnificent Mudcat Inn when they visited. Amar and Annie enjoyed many quiet years and beautiful home marriage in Catfish Creek afterwards. Eulogies went from a weekly event to something that rarely occurred at all. The town itself felt more comfortable, like the air was cleaner, and an unconscious feeling among the populace that they were finally free. Though after many years, Amar did find that the visiting women did keep their word. One dark and stormy night, a pair of men came into the Mudcat Inn. Both were soaked to the bone and pale as a sheet. Amar could see, even through their closed mouths, their prominent eye teeth, and he could also see, despite the cold night, that the men didn't shiver at all. Amar would later know these men as Gary and Larry. Cute couple, quiet and kept to themselves, but cute. Gary handed Amar a business card with a simple request. Put them up for a few nights. I'll cover the charges. M.G. And on the other side of the card was the familiar coat of arms. A golden shield with a screaming gorgon on it. The same coat of arms used by those visitors all those years ago. Amar smiled as he led these men to their rooms. They never left during the day, preferring to run their errands at night, when, even after all these years, most of Catfish Creek stayed in. So Amar asked his son Alexander, who at the time still a young man, to help keep the grocery store open for them so they could eat and buy things. That small favor seemed to make all the difference for those two. Gary and Larry eventually moved into one of the empty houses in Catfish Creek, and they both worked for Amar now, covering the night shift for him so he could sleep at night and spend time with his family. And throughout the years, there were many more odd guests in the Mudcat Inn. Sometimes visitors didn't have a face. Amar didn't question it. It wasn't his business, and he simply did his best to make sure the room was comfortable for them. He even learned sign language to better understand his faceless friends better. They were quiet guests and very respectful of others. Amar often wondered if they had anywhere else they could go, but he decided it was best not to ask. Sometimes guests coming in had wings behind them. Amar knew better than to bring it up to them. In his experience, guests generally didn't like talking about their appendages after a long day of traveling. They just wanted a warm bed and a quiet room, and Amar had both to provide them, handing them their keys before watching them walk away, their wings trailing behind him. He also had many guests of another nature, those who had shields on their chests and who came in with many heavy bags that needed help from both Amar and Alex to bring them to their rooms. These guests had a look about them, like they expected a fight to occur anywhere. But they had their composure relax just a little bit when Amar brought them to their rooms. These hunters often came to Catfish Creek on their way to or from somewhere, but they always stopped at Catfish Creek, simply for the fact that they knew they were welcome and no one was going to question who they were or what they were doing. So, now Amar and his entire family were considered honorary parts of the Hunters Guild. It came with many small perks he wasn't expecting when he first joined. Though he paid a fee each year towards the guild, the hunters visiting brought him more than enough money to cover it. His wife, as a librarian, had access to books, stories, and first-hand accounts that most people could only dream of. All of his children would have their college tuition paid for, no questions asked. They simply walked into the financial aid office, and the tuition was paid in full. Alexis learned under the best investigators in the 7 cities, those that taught her how to apply knowledge, curiosity, and how something as simple as inflection and word choice would reshape entire conversations. Alexander learned the best small business skills from those that kept themselves afloat from gig to gig. He rapidly went from bagging groceries to owning the grocery store in just a few years. And as for Alex, they found their passion for all things behind the veil, and they found connections with people like them. And they came home themselves for the first time in their lives towards a loving family. And to this day, Alex helped Amar manage the Mudcat Inn, and they would still tell their father about stories of the worlds beyond their own, even if Amar didn't understand it all very well. When he made that first call all those years ago, he imagined he would be asked to do some important job, maybe even the kill itself. He imagined he would be helping taking down the wolves that patrolled the streets of Catfish Creek. He was initially disappointed by his seemingly non-role towards the hunt. But as he got older and he got more experienced, he realized why the Hunters Guild loved his family so much. It's easy to see all of the big deeds, slaying the dragon, stealing the hoard, or even giving the quest. But it's real easy to skip over all the small details. The person who kept a safe place to sleep for the heroes. The shopkeeper who sold the food to the heroes. The librarian who kept all of the stories and information about the monsters out in the world. The reporter who wrote articles about church bake sales. But when you're out in the world, facing the darkness that laid beyond the veil in all of our lives, you need someone you can trust. Someone who could do business with a customer even when they don't look normal. Someone who you could speak to because they can understand what it is you face, even if they never face it themselves. To all of the visiting hunters and all of the strange visitors Amar helped make the sanctuary that was Catfish Creek possible. And it all started when, as a young man, Amar refused to accept that there was nothing to be done about the wolves. Amar was brought back to the present when he saw someone approach his front desk from across the parking lot. He could see that she was translucent and dressed in a brown dress as she passed through the door, but Amar kept his comfortable warm smile on his face as he said, "Welcome to the Mudcat Inn. How can I assist you on this wonderful day?"